the photo there, you can see that this is Dawn Wiltshire, who I've worked with since I was postdoctoral researcher starting at Oxford University in 2007. And she is holding a gingerbread man, which says, "None of us are free until all of us are free, LB." And the LB is for Laughing Boy, which is our son Connor Sparrowhawk, who I'll come back to talk about a bit later. So I wanted to, I've been thinking about this lecture and thinking back to when I was doing my doctoral study at Warwick, finished in 2006, and thinking about what I've learned since, I suppose, since then, and what might be helpful to think about. So some bumps along the way. The first one is going to be dealt with quickly, and then the others get a little bit more nuanced, I suppose. Don't get hung up on numbers in qualitative research, because it is get this number game and feeling like, you haven't got enough and your sample's too small and it's anecdotal, and all the criticisms that come along with qualitative research and the ignorance around qualitative research demonstrated by people who don't do it is quite extraordinary, and it's quite a difficult thing to negotiate when you're first starting out. Luckily, since I finished, there's two cracking examples here of what you need to read and how you need to defend your sample size in your thesis. So first of all, Mark Mason did this lovely review of sample sizes in qualitative research projects and found that they were largely multiples of 10, which completely contradicted the idea or concept of saturation. So this paper gives a very good background into different sample sizes in qualitative studies and raises the issue that either students don't understand the concept of saturation, which is contested anyway, or they're sort of like being tyrannized by ethics committees because you put in the number 25 or the number 30 and then you feel you have to stick to it. So this is a great resource to unpack that. And then just out in January, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, Henning and Kaiser have explored saturation, and again give this really lovely review of how saturation is used, different ways you could use the concept if you want to. And they found that the sample sizes were 7 to 14 for interviews and 2 to 4 for focus groups. So hopefully that might make some of you in the room a bit more relaxed about that. So that's the numbers bump. The second bump along the way speaks very much to what Judge Singh was just saying, which is people are not hard to reach. And we really shouldn't think in terms of this. And if you are doing research on a topic, you really need to work with the people who are experiencing that topic, and you might be experiencing it yourself. If you don't have personal experience of that topic, it is your duty, I think, to go and immerse yourself in that area and spend time with people and develop your networks that way. And when I first started my postdoctoral project, I was doing a project about autism, and I contacted the local self-advocacy group who told me to bugger off, basically, because they were really sick of researchers, and they said that they didn't really use the label of autism, that they were self-advocates. And so I went back to them and said, well, did you want me to can I do some training? Do you want me to help some of your self-advocates develop some qualitative research skills? They said yes. And I think, again, you have to accept that you have to invest time and humanness in this process to really do robust research. And in the process of doing a training course with the self-advocates, I learned so much about how poor my research project was, because my research, I was developing an interview guide with them, and the things that were important to the people I was training hadn't even crossed my mind. They were talking about things like, who has the remote control in your house? Do you have a front door key? Whereas I was thinking at a much broader level, which was completely based on what I knew and understood. So some quotes here just to underpin the importance of this. And again, Judge Singh spoke about this. The oppressed are better practical sociologists and possibly the only ones truly awake to the social world. And I totally agree with this. And I think that if you're somewhere bubbling around the middle of society, you don't see what other people who are very much on the margins see. They have a much keener view of what is happening. And I wince repeatedly at my own assumptions and the assumptions of people around me in this respect, because it speaks to such ignorance and entitlement. It makes me feel really uncomfortable. So that's the first quote I wanted to pick up on. The second quote is from Robert McClure, as a critical disability studies scholar who haunts the margins of the work we do, the margins of the feminist, the queer, the disabled worlds. What would an ongoing commitment to those spectral presences entail? And how much do we just exclude people through our practices? How many papers do we read where they sort of say, oh, the sample was white middle class, end of. Too difficult to recruit anybody else. No consideration whatsoever of the rich experiences and diversity that are these spectral presences. This is, you know, that we are not doing our job properly because we are not involving people. And I think when I went to work at Oxford University, I was working for a project that published research on a website called healthtalk.org, which is a useful resource to have a look at. And they had, at that time, they've got over 100 conditions now, different cancers, pregnancy, all sorts of different health issues, where 40 people are interviewed because it has to be a multiple of 10. And the video extracts are put on the website. And when I started working there, I sort of looked, obviously grazed the site a lot and sort of said, well, where's people with learning disabilities? And they said, we haven't got a project about that. We haven't done a learning disability project yet. And I was like, well, you don't need to do a learning disability project to include people who have got a learning disability in cancer, for example, in your cancer project, or people who have had a baby in the maternity project, or people who, whatever, I mean, anything, health and well-being, weight, all these conditions people with learning disabilities have, and yet there was nobody on the website with a learning disability. Quite extraordinary exclusions that nobody notices. And this spreads to other marginalised groups as well. And the final quote in this section is from Hannah Arendt, who sort of, she's sort of saying that it's incumbent on us to be able to see the things that are close to us without prejudice, to be able to see clearly, to clearly see what is around us, and at the same time make that which is so far away at the margins close enough to us to be able to understand it, and also to care as if it was our own affair, because these issues, the issues that affect marginalised groups, are issues that affect all of us. They're public issues, not private troubles, if you think, going back to C. Wright Mills. An example of this is a book by Rachel Simon, who was she's a journalist, and it's been made into a film actually with Andy McDowell. Andy McDowell is excruciatingly poor. So she's a journalist who had a sister with learning disabilities, who I think was in her 30s in America, and her sister spent her every day riding the buses around the city she lived in. And Rachel Simon felt that this was a terrible waste of time. And she couldn't really understand why her sister did it. And she thought her sister should get a job, basically, or do something more productive. And so she decided to spend a year riding the bus with her sister. And it's a fascinating exploration of the way in which Rachel finally understood more about her sister. And she could see that her sister was really savvy about which buses she got on, which drivers to ignore, because they were not pleasant to her. She really enjoyed the bus rides, and Rachel began to understand that if her sister got a job, she would be penalised by the system in the States around money. And so actually she was leading a very rich, fulfilled life riding these buses. She wasn't in danger, as Rachel thought, and she wasn't wasting her time. And then, as said, and there's an academic article about this book, says that it took a year of period emotion and immersion in her sister's life to realise that they're reaching. Oh, sorry, I can't read the slide because you lot are all in the side. But you can read it yourselves, isn't it? That Rachel starts to learn more about herself as well and realise that the sort of limitations to her own life and the lack of richness in her own life in the process of doing this. Okay. So related to this, all these bumps are interrelated with each other apart from the numbers, which was why that was dealt with quickly. So completely related to this is park your assumptions. Now, to give you an example which makes me wince still, is that Spall et al. Published this commentary in The Lancet, I think 2020, a couple of years ago now. And they went back through all the research funded by the National Institute of Health Research in their portfolio. So 26,293 studies in England. And they found that a great chunk of these studies use learning disability as an exclusion criteria in their samples, even though much of this research was focusing on health conditions that are quite prevalent amongst people with learning disabilities. And so this is so wrong in so many different levels, and again comes back to that being able to see what's around you clearly. How on earth did ethics committees approve studies that said excluded people with learning disabilities? On what basis was that okay? And yet it obviously was. On what basis did the study team say, well, we're going to exclude that million and 1.1 million people in the UK? Well, they're not going to take part because a gap. There is no explanation for it. None of these studies said because people lack capacity. You have no idea if people lack capacity. There's a Mental Health Act which clearly says that you assume people have capacity till otherwise proven. And it's your responsibility as a researcher to go through the relevant steps to make sure that people have capacity to take part in your study. That's your job. It's that extra work that you have to do because you should be inclusive. You do not exclude. We should not have the government-funded research body having this massive amount of studies with this flaw in that is visible to everybody. So hats off to Spall and et al. For doing this work. So important. And another example of my own experience here is, and this is actually quite funny. This is a brilliant paper. And when I used to present it before it's published, I always used to end up with a woof woof at the end. It's one of these joyful papers that everybody loves if you love pets. I was doing a secondary analysis of the Health Talk data because each of those 40 interviews are stored in an archive, and there's now 3,000 or 4,000 interviews. So fantastic resource to dive in like a sweet shop. But I was tasked as a junior researcher to do a review of people's experiences of domiciliary care, which was really tough because nobody talked about it, because again, it was one of those blank spots that nobody thinks about when you're interviewing somebody about cancer or something else. So there was very little in the data for the project I was tasked to do, but I did get quite interested in pets because people talked about their pets before they talked about their human relations, in terms of I had to get home from hospital because, obviously my dog was missing me and the kids and my partner as well. And then I noticed that in these interviews that were all transcribed verbatim, allegedly, the transcribers, if a pet came into the interview or there was pet disruption, the transcribers didn't transcribe. They'd put interruption and then just wait till the pet had gone. So I went back to the original recordings which we had and transcribed the bits that were missing, which was really interesting because that was data that transcribers had taken it upon themselves to not transcribe, and the researchers just to let them. And then the other interesting point about all of this was the findings were absolutely fascinating around people's experiences with their pets when they have a long-term condition. And on the Health Talk website, where the whole point of that website is researchers are supposed to present the entire package of stories around that particular experience, there wasn't any mention of pets. So the researchers themselves had erased the pet interactions, completely undermining the robustness of the research. So I published this paper, which is a great read, and I really recommend it. But again, it's those assumptions, isn't it? And I can guarantee that in that data archive, there will be bits that everybody's erased bits because they're not interested in them, religion or something else, that you simply don't see because you're looking at cancer. I'm only looking at cancer experiences, and I want those experiences related to cancer. So that's worth a read anyway. Bend the rules where necessary. Now, this is, again, you don't, in your qualitative research, you can do anything you like as long as you can account for it and explain why you're doing it. There is no reason why if you reach a bump because your research design isn't working, then you tweak it. And you may need to go back to ethics and make a minor amendment, but you change what you're doing and you bend the rules. One example of this was I was working on a project about people's experiences of genomes, the 100,000 Genome Project. And we were doing focus groups with members of the public, but we kept getting these professional members of the public volunteering. When we were recruiting, we were holding these focus groups where everybody was just being really not like a member of the public and being very sort of PPI dominated. that they volunteered because that's what they did. They were a retired medic and a retired this and a retired that. And the groups were excruciating. So what we did in the end, because we were desperate to get a diverse sample, was the researchers went to a part of Birmingham that was really ethically diverse outside a shopping centre, set up a table with a few flyers on saying, we're going to hold a focus group at 11 o'clock and a focus group at 2 o'clock if you want to come along. And we managed to get members of the public, people who were just busy shopping on that day in that area, which enabled us to actually hear and generate data that was useful to the project, as opposed to the I don't know, staged data, predictable data. So that was one example. And then another example from the autism project I was doing back in the day was somebody got in touch and about the taking part. And then she came back to me. I was emailing this person and I sort of followed up the email when she asked for details. And so I contacted her again and she said, I cannot find a way for health people to listen to what I say as my communication isn't good. I get confused and people don't wait long enough for me to get what I want to say. And again, this was a real sort of sucker punch for me, because I sort of thought, isn't that terrible that health people don't allow space for people to say what they want to say? And then I sort of went back to her again and she said, well, I'm not clever. I don't really know what is wanted. So I think I have nothing to say. And this really sort of played on my mind a bit, because I thought, even back then, I was sort of thinking, this is terrible that our research methods are actually excluding people in a way. And she's actually having to sort of present herself in this way to me. So I said to her, should we do it by email? Did you want to write? Because she said she didn't like having people in her space either. So we did this email interview, which went on across 6 weeks. I think it was a lot of work. It was quite an interesting experience, but I'll just give you an example of one of the emails she sent just to show what I nearly missed in that project. So she transformed from being this very hesitant, I'll let you read that, very hesitant sort of like person who just wrote this prose for me. It was absolutely extraordinary what this insight into her life and her joy of nature and children. So again, that's a lesson here about don't give up and don't be scared to break the rules. That's one of the beauties of qualitative research. Just make sure you explain what you've done and why, and that you have the relevant permission. Okay, moving on. These slides will be shared after anyway, so listen properly. Now I'm going to try and show 2 video clips now, so that's bound to go wrong, but I'll give it a go. The importance, this comes into the assumptions, this comes into the people aren't hard to reach. Listen and question, listen and think. If you're interviewing somebody, say your project's on stigma, chat, and somebody, or whatever it is, and somebody says a word, even though you think you know what it is, it's always really good practice to sort of say, can I just ask what you mean by that? Get people to operationalize the terms they use. Because otherwise you're just going to come in with your social science head and think, oh yeah, they've just said that. Pick that out. And they might not have meant what you understand as that term at all. So listen properly. There were 2 extracts from the autism project. So I recommend that you go and have a little graze of that project and see people talking. And the point I was going to make there was that again, that concern around not having the time to order your thoughts and speak was very apparent in the interviews where people were interviewed. And there are such tremendous gaps and spaces in those interviews, because I just learned that I should not interrupt people and allow people the space. And I quite wince when we see people who haven't practiced their interviewing that well, sort of leaping in and talking over people who are just trying to order their thoughts, I suppose. Okay, so justice for wellbeing. Now I'm going to take a bit of a diversion here to talk a little bit about the scholar activism that Caroline mentioned. So a brief introduction, you can Google this, it's all online. My 18-year-old son who had learning disabilities died a preventable death in a NHS hospital in 2013, where he was left to Bath on his own and drowned. Absolutely atrocious, scandalous happening. That at that point, I just hooked up with a couple of academics None of this was planned. It was totally spontaneous. We got a hashtag Justice for LB, instantly drawing on research skills of reading, critically reading reports, searching for information, being able to sort of compile stuff together really coherently. And we started this campaign, Justice for LB, to try to get accountability. The trust itself said that Connor died of natural causes straight away and tried to cover it up. So we sort of ran a campaign a year after he died, because he spent 107 days in this hospital, supposedly getting treatment. And so we decided in March 2014 to celebrate the 107 days he spent there. And we sort of like got people to adopt days to do something, to raise awareness around the terrible treatment of people with learning disabilities in the UK, and raise funding, because we had to pay for legal funds to represent ourselves at Connor's inquest, which was £25,000. So I'm just going to give you a couple of slides here to show you the reach of this project, which spread internationally. And there's a website called 107 Days of Action, which shows you all 107 days of action, and the actions are extraordinary. So Connor loved buses, and people started sending in pictures of buses, hundreds of drawings of buses electronically. This is all via the hashtag on Twitter. We held parties, fundraising parties at work. Somebody took the Justice for LB flag to Glastonbury, and it was on the front of BBC News, and people were tweeting, who is Justice for LB? An academic in Canada took a photo of Canadian buses every day and posted it on Twitter. What else did we do? There was a massive quilt was made and hung up at the Manchester People's History Museum. Somebody took the Justice for LB flag to Australia and New Zealand, and it was held up by the New Zealand Commissioner for Disabilities in New Zealand. In this picture at the bottom, that's Paul Scarrett, who I worked with, did the training with in 2007. In 2017 and 18, we walked a cardboard bus that somebody made across the Camino in Spain and talked about what happened. And we actually got on Spanish news, because Spanish people were completely and utterly bewildered that anybody could be treated so bad. So this campaign was absolutely massive. And then eventually we managed to get a criminal prosecution of the trust, and Oxford County Crown Court, in March 2018, the judge found the trust guilty of neglect, and they were fined. And we were warned that the fine would be small because it's an NHS trust. And we were all there. I think all the campaign people were there. The courtroom was packed. BBC News, Channel 4, all the media people were there, and the judge fined the trust £2 million. And it was the biggest fine in the history of the NHS. All this magic happened as an outcome of being a qualitative researcher and an activist. So I think my point I'm trying to make here is you have, and this is what Judge Singh was saying, that you will have the skills and the knowledge and the expertise, and you need to use that expertise and skills for common good. It's a responsibility, I think, that no researcher should not use their skills to help other people and to try to unpack inequalities. And then we come back to the scholar activism crossover, that we write about this stuff, published a chapter in a book around the sort of use of social media and this campaign that we run, and the importance of documenting it, making the campaign so accessible. We encouraged anybody who could take part at any level. Some people, 2 villages in Yorkshire held a tea party, just drawing a picture of a bus. People could contribute in any way they could. And we raised the funds, the £25,000, through all sorts of fundraising events across the country. And we were able, we got the funding back because the inquest was found that Connor died of neglect. And so we got the funding back, and we were able to give the funding to 2 charities that had supported Connor during his life.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was absolutely fascinating. And as you said, it spoke so well to what Judge Singh had started us off on. And I can think of so many questions I'd like to ask, but I will not abuse Chair's privilege.